Hi guys, Eric Knudsen here, professional cycling coach. And in today's video, I want to show you the process that I use to go about planning out an entire season. Now, this is a process that I've developed and have been using on myself for quite a few years now, and it's the exact same process that I use in my coaching business. And I developed this process because I wanted something that was really efficient, very effective, and also very customizable. And I want to share this because I remember how challenging it can be to implement all the training principles that are out there. And I also know just how rewarding it can be to self-coach when you really know how to do it. This will be a series of videos, so be sure to hit subscribe and the bell icon. And when I do release them, I'll put those next videos in the description below. But first, if you want to follow along with what I'm showing in this video and do it yourself, be sure to download the Self-Coach Cyclist ATP in the link below. In it, you can plan your whole season with blocks, play with ramp rates to see what happens to your CTL, use my cheat sheet that has an assortment of guides and zone calculators, and see example seasons that you can use as reference. And if you really like the process, there's blocks available for purchase that you can customize, all the way down to individual workouts with the provided instructions. This is a must-have tool if you want to be your own best coach, and I'll show you how to use all of it here on my channel. So here are the steps that I use to plan out an entire season, and there's only 3 of them. First, I'll write down all my races. I'll decide what priority to give each of those races. I'll document family stuff. I'll plan out any work travel that I know of in advance. Then I'll decide on my training blocks. And then last, I'll set ramp rates, and we'll talk about ramp rates in the next video. But that's literally all I do to plan out an entire season. Now, our first inclination, in terms of where to write all this stuff down, our first inclination is to put it all in one spot. So if you use Training Peaks, for example, our first inclination is just to enter in all your races in Training Peaks. Maybe you know how to do that. And then for deciding on training blocks, maybe to do that, you'll just buy a pre-made training plan and you'll populate it all in Training Peaks. The same goes for even if you use Trainer Road. This just have everything all in one spot for simplicity. Now, here's the thing. That is actually a mistake. I have found this out the hard way many years. When you take all of these things and put it in a separate document called an annual training plan or an ATP, it is a total game changer. And here's why. When you're your own coach and you're trying to plan out your season, you actually, to really do it correctly, you need to be able to think at a high level and also be able to think in detail at the same time. Now, this is very, very hard to do. You need to be able to see the forest through the trees while simultaneously be able to see the trees through the forest, if that makes sense. Since this is so hard to do, separating your high-level planning from your detailed planning solves that problem. And so it looks like this: your high level and your detail, 2 separate tools, your high level and your annual training plan. And I like to use a spreadsheet. A spreadsheet works awesome for this. And then all your detail, where your workouts are stored. The tool I like to use is Training Peaks. I really like it. You can use whatever tool you want, but as long as that's separate, all your detail, your analysis stuff is in a separate tool from your high level planning. It makes it so much more clear when you get into your season on the direction that you need to take. And how I have my tool set up, I actually have it set up so that I can update it with how I'm doing. And if I start getting off track, I can see that really early and I can see how I'm getting off track. And it's just impossible to be able to do this if you're only using one tool. So I wanted to show you a little analogy of this whole process just so that it makes sense. And the analogy is of a painting. And if you've ever watched artists on YouTube or on TV do paintings, this will make sense. So they always start with a blank canvas, obviously, and then they just start rough sketching things in that they know they're going to need to fill in the details later, but it's just rough. You watching it, sometimes you don't even know what they're drawing, but it's just kind of interesting to watch the whole process unfold. Eventually, they'll get to a point in the drawing where you're like, oh, now I see what they're actually trying to draw. In this case, it's an owl. Step 4, you can clearly see the wings, the beak, the eyes. Clearly it's an owl, pretty cool. That's where they were going with this whole thing. Then after that, they'll start filling in even more details. So details around the wings and on the head. And then maybe even they'll start adding in all the color. As they start adding in all of this detail and the color, like in step 6, all of a sudden at the end, you'll have this awesome drawing and it's like, wow, that's really cool, really sweet. There you go. Now, if you didn't watch the whole process and you wanted to just duplicate that owl, you might mistakenly just pick up a colored pencil and try to start shading things in, and things aren't going to turn out nearly like step 6 because you didn't understand what the whole process was behind it. This is kind of how a lot of us cyclists normally jump into training for a key event. For example, if you've got a century ride that you really want to do in 4 or 5 months, you might just jump in and say, okay, so what type of workout should I do? That's the same thing as adding color in a drawing like this. It's like there's a lot of steps that you need to go through first before you start really thinking about what workouts to do. So in this process that I'm showing you here, it kind of looks like this. Steps 1 through 4, that's all occurring in your annual training plan in that spreadsheet, the high level stuff. When we get to step 4, after we've added in all the ramp rates, this will be your playbook for all the detail planning that you'll do throughout the season. And you'll be able to update it, but you'll have something that clearly looks like, okay, so this is actually something that I can work with. Now I can start adding in the details that are relevant. Eventually, in later videos, we'll talk about how to customize each of these workouts to you and how to customize your weeks. But we can worry about that later. In the end, you're going to end up with a fully customized plan tailored to your schedule, your fitness, what your preferences are, and it's something that you'll be really motivated to follow. So now let's take a look at what these steps actually look like in an ATP. So write down races, family stuff, and work travel. But first, let's make sure that we're aligned on A priority, C, and B priority races. And I think most people kind of understand this, but just to make sure we're on the same page, A priority races, you want really a maximum of 2, maybe 3. 2 races. A lot of times I just do 1 A priority event or race a year. And this is what the entire schedule is built and based off of. You want to separate these by at least 3 months. You could go shorter. Longer is actually better, but 3 months is kind of like the minimum that I like to use. Then you have your B priority races, and these races, they're going to fall wherever they are. You're not going to change your overall schedule. You'll just adjust that week only to make sure that you're fresh for the event. And then C priority races, you're not going to change anything in your schedule. You train right through, you treat them literally like a training race. Now I'm talking a lot about racing. If you don't race and you don't want to race, that is totally cool. It's still a really good idea though, to add in, maybe you've had a loop that you've always wanted to do, or a certain distance that you've always wanted to do, 100 miles, maybe even more. Go ahead and circle a date on your calendar and just say, this is my A priority event. I'm going to train for this. And it adds purpose and clarity into all your training when you back up from there. And so even if you don't have an event that you're trying to train for specifically, just go ahead and pick a date, like maybe in the middle of the summer, and just try to do whatever that big loop or big ride is that you've always wanted to do. So now we're in the ATP. You could also create this yourself pretty easily, but keep in mind that when we get to the next section on ramp rates, that might get kind of annoying because there's some kind of calculations in there. Okay, the first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to make sure that your calendar lines up with the date for today. So to start your calendar, go to column B10 and enter a Monday for when you want to start. So in this example, I'm just going to use May 8th as my Monday. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with my A priority event. And in this example, I'm just going to use an 80-mile gravel event. And I'm going to say that it starts on September 2nd. Okay, so I have my 80-mile gravel event in, and that's my A priority event. Now I'm going to fill in all the B priority events and the C priority events. Okay, so now I just filled in a couple of random events. I have my 80-mile gravel race on September 2nd, and then I have some miscellaneous B and C races. So then the last step is to fill in any kind of family vacations, any work trips that you know of, and I'll just make some things up just for the example here. Okay, so now we have something that looks like this. Our races and events filled in, got some families, a little weekend in the mountains, and then we've got a work trip filled in. Okay, so once you've decided on your schedule, you can move on to deciding on training blocks. And this is an area that I think can get a little confusing at first, but it actually doesn't need to be. There are a lot of different names for blocks out there. But really, when you kind of boil it down and really look at the details and understand what's going on, blocks normally fall into one of two categories. And it kind of depends on the hard efforts. So you want to look at, with your hard efforts in that block, are they primarily focused on zones like tempo, sweet spot, or threshold? If that's the case, I say they fall into the aerobic category. Or are the hard efforts primarily focused on VO2 type efforts, the really hard efforts? In that case, they fall into the VO2 category of block. So each of these categories of blocks are really focused on different areas of your power duration curve. So aerobic blocks are focused more right below FTP, and then obviously VO2 focused above FTP. But how you can kind of think about this is aerobic blocks are really focused on your muscle and building your mitochondrial function. So you're building your aerobic engine, you're able to build your CTL really nicely, and you're building muscular endurance. Really, really important, these aerobic blocks. And then VO2 is a little bit more focused on your heart. Your heart's beating really hard. You're increasing the amount of blood volume that gets pumped out from your heart. So here are some common names of blocks. Under aerobic category, base I think is the most popular. I actually don't call my blocks base because they are so good at making you really strong, and base is something that you should be doing year round. July is a great time for base, but no one really wants to be doing a base block in July. So I actually don't use the word base for blocks, but there's also sweet spot or SST, aerobic endurance foundation extensive. If you purchase training plans or blocks, these are some of the common names. And then under VO2, build I think might be one of the most popular block names that fall into the VO2 category. Certainly some call it VO2. Polarized falls into that VO2 category. Race, aerobic capacity, advanced, intensive, but these are some common block names. So planning rules with these blocks. For aerobic blocks, I do a maximum of 3. I know that some others do 4 and even 5, but I found that after 3, you start to get burnt out and plateau. All of these blocks are 4 weeks, 3 weeks on, 1 week recovery. You can also do 2 weeks on and 1 week recovery. VO2 blocks, maximum of 2. Really, after 4 to 6 weeks, you've kind of peaked out of your potential on these types of intervals, and you want to mix it back up. So these are also 4 weeks on, or 4 weeks, 3 weeks on, 1 week recovery. You can also do 2. But you can see here after, if you really do this at the maximum, you do 3 aerobic blocks, 2 VO2s, you're only 5 months into the season. So after that, you really need to change things back up and go back to like an aerobic block after all that. And this works really, really well. My best legs of the year usually come from doing like 3 aerobic blocks of VO2, and then I'll go back to an aerobic block. And then by that time, my legs are just feeling phenomenal. I'm having some really, really fun rides. So this is what it might look like planning all those blocks out before an A priority race. Or event. So in this case, let's take an 80-mile gravel race as an example. What's important with this is you want to pay attention to how you're planning on doing the event. If you're planning on being in the mix for an 80-mile gravel race and attacking climbs, you want to have some intensity in there right before your event. So in this case, if you back up, you do 2 VO2 blocks, and then leading up to all that, you back up more and you do 3 aerobic blocks. This is kind of like a real standard layout here. If on the other hand, for 80 miles for you on gravel means just finishing, you may not need to do a lot of intensity right before that. It might be better for you to just do some aerobic blocks leading up to that point. So let's look at another example. This one is a 200-mile road race. So in this example, most people for 200 miles, your intent is just to finish. And in this case, if you wanted to back up from there, maybe you would just do 3 aerobic blocks leading up to that. And then before that, you would do 2 VO2 blocks because you still want to be able to do intensity throughout the season. So this is like a reverse periodization that works really well as well. Let's take one more example. In this one, let's say there's a mountain bike race that you want to do really well in the late spring, but you don't necessarily want to peak. And maybe you don't want to do a big overload and formal taper. For this type of event, what you could do is you could just do a regular VO2 block right before that. Back up from there, do 3 aerobic blocks. Back up from there, maybe this is December, January. You do a VO2 block just so you're not doing so many aerobic blocks in a row. So now we're almost ready to add in our blocks to our ATP, but first we need a little bit more detail because so far we've just been talking about block categories, but we need actual names. So these are the block names and the blocks that I actually use, and there's only 7 of them. There's enough here to keep you entertained for years and to really learn kind of a lot about what your body responds best to. But under aerobic category, I have an aerobic block 1, 2, 3, and then threshold. The difference as you go down is just that the patterns get more difficult. So for an aerobic 1, the time that you have in between your hard days is the most, and then it gets smaller and smaller as you go down. Aerobic 3 also introduces a little bit of over-under type work and lactate buffering, but generally it's just the patterns get more difficult as you go down. VO2, same kind of deal. VO2 1, and then I have a VO2 2 that's slightly harder pattern. And then finally, there's your overload and taper 4-week block that you'd have before your A priority event. Now keep in mind, one thing about overload and taper under a VO2 category, if you wanted to do an overload and taper, but you don't want the intensity, you can replace those hard VO2 days with aerobic, like a sweet spot type work. So our 80-mile gravel race will be the example that we use in our ATP, and I want to just show you some of the logic when you're assigning these block names. So we're starting off with 3 aerobic categories of blocks. We can choose any of these 4, and preferably you'd want to do them in some sort of an order. So here's the thing with self-coaching, and here's just the thing in general. There is no right answer. And anyone who tells you that there's one set way that you have to do something for some race it's just not true. The beauty of self-coaching is that you have options and you get to figure out what works really well for you, what you like to do, what you recover well from, and what you just enjoy doing. And knowing that there's not one right answer. There's a good answer for you, but what works for you doesn't necessarily work for everyone else. So you could do, if you're doing 3 aerobic blocks, you could do 1, 2, and 3 and call it good there. What I like to do is I really like aerobic block 2, and I'll do 2 back to back. So I'll do 2 aerobic 2 blocks back to back, and then I'll use ramp rate to make sure that each one is getting harder and harder. And then I'll end with an aerobic block 3, because that one works really well for me. Some other people really enjoy threshold blocks, so they would end maybe with a threshold block. But really, there's lots of options, and it's for you to kind of figure it out and really have fun with it. You've got time. And then onto the VO2 blocks, you have options here too. You could do a VO2 1, a VO2 2, could do a VO2 2, and then an overload and taper. Preferably, I'd recommend if it's an A race, you'd want to do an overload and taper. Or you could do a VO2 1 and then an overload and taper. So you can kind of play around with some things there. Okay, so now we're in our ATP, so let's assign blocks. Now our A event, 80-mile gravel, I moved to September 30th just to make everything fit. This is just for the example. But what we would want to do is we come over here into column I, and this is where we assign all of our blocks. If you hover over I9, I have some just general comments and guidelines for you as you work through this. And now what we want to do is there's a drop down here. Click the drop down and we have all of our block names. Now these are the ones that I mentioned in falling into one of those 2 categories. If you have other block names that you like to use better, you can change this. This is the beauty of Excel. It's all yours. It's lots of flexibility. But we want to, it's an A race, so we want to end with an overload and taper. So how this works is an overload and taper is basically 2 weeks of overload and 2 weeks of taper. So we work backwards. So we go 2 weeks of taper and then 2 weeks of overload. And then an overload and taper is the one that works a little bit differently from the other ones, just of how it looks. So there we have our overload and taper. Now we want to continue working backwards. So before we had a VO2 block before this overload and taper. So we always want to end in a recovery. So we're going to work backwards and we're going to start with a recovery. So we do a recovery and then we'll do a VO2 block. And we could do VO2 1 or 2, and I just did VO2 2, and I really liked it. That's just kind of my favorite. So now we have 2 blocks assigned. They're both VO2. Now the next one that we had in there as we work backwards was an aerobic block. So let's add in that, starting with a recovery. And we'll do aerobic 3, I think. We could do threshold, aerobic 3, or aerobic 2. But let's just do 3. And then we'll do another aerobic block before that. So again, start with a recovery. Let's do 2. Just keep things really nice and clean. And then for our last one, start with a recovery, and we'll just do aerobic 1. Okay, so there we've assigned all our blocks leading up to our A priority event, and that's literally how easy it is. That's what I do. Obviously, in my mind, I'm always thinking what categories these fall into and just making sure I'm abiding by those rules. So now we can see here all in one view how our blocks ended up lining up with the rest of our schedule. So how our blocks line up with our B and C priority races and our work travel and our time in the mountains. Now, one thing you'll notice is that for B and C priority races, I do not change the start date or really the end date for blocks to accommodate. When you do that, it just gets really complicated. So for B races, the only things I will change is during that week, maybe I'll let up a little bit on a harder workout just to make sure I'm fresh. And then C priority races, I don't change anything. Now, another thing you'll notice here is that, what do you know, family mountain time and a work trip just ended up landing on a recovery week. Okay, so things never lined up like that in real life. I was just trying to make this really simple and straightforward for this example. But when you have things in a view like this, it makes it so much easier to be able to plan around things when your schedule just doesn't look this nice. So for example, if your work trip ended up having to fall on the 12th, a week later, now I have a format, and especially when we start adding in ramp rates, where we can do some pretty cool planning around that. If we were just only looking at the Training Peaks view, where you have all of that detail and all the detail of the workouts, it gets it gets tricky to kind of plan around that. All right, so that's how I plan out a whole season using an ATP and training blocks. Be sure to look for the next video where I talk about ramp rates and how we customize each block in each week to the total workload that works best for you. Again, my name is Eric Knudsen. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.